What's up everyone, it's Javi here, and in this video we're going to be looking at how to create components, how to document them, and how to apply them in this case to our Google search experience design. So far we've covered color, we've covered typography, and we've talked just enough about spacing in order for you to get to know the most important things before we talked about components in this video. I'm not going to be going too much in depth about what a component is, but if this is the first time you encounter components, then I encourage you to open up the video description. There will be a link to a guide about what components are directly from the amazing Figma team, when you can read everything about there is to know about components in design. So let's get right to it. So in the last video, we talked a little about text styles and typography, and we ended up with this new section right here called typography. So now we have both our color tokens and our typography tokens. In this video, we're going to look at how to create one of the three components that we will be using in our Google homepage design, and that is going to be the search. I'm just going to go ahead and come back to any of my previous screens here, because we already have a baseline for what this search box looks like, right? I'm going to come here, I'm going to paste it. And just because I'm pasting it in this background, I'm going to give it a fill as well of background. And probably I don't want to do this one. I want to actually go to this end state one from color styles. So we keep those color styles as part of the layer here. Okay, so now we can use background. And this is where we're at, right? So the hotkey that you want to familiarize yourself with in order to make anything a component is going to be Command-Alt-K, right? So you saw that instantly we went from this having the sort of frame icon, and now when I do Command-Alt-K, you have this sort of diamond shape icon that illustrates that what you're looking at is a component. And it's not just any kind of component, it's a main component. To illustrate what that means, I can just Alt and drag to create a copy of this. And you can see that now I have two components. The difference is that one is the main, and the other one that is this diamond shaped without the illustration here in the middle is that this is a child component of the parent, meaning that this is an instance or a copy of the parent component right here. And if I were to move or modify any of this in the parent component, then the children will act accordingly as well. Okay, so now that we've created our component, the next thing we can do is come over to the component itself and click on this button here called variants. And we can say add new variant, right? And I'm just gonna delete this one for the time being. But essentially, we use variants in Figma in order to define different states of the component. Because this component does not just have one single representation, right? How you interact with the search, the design of the component will change with it as well. If we were to go to our google.com page and see this component live, you can see that, for example, as I hover over it, there is a change of state. And this state is the hover state, right? So you can see that in this case, the stroke around the search component is going to disappear. And then we're going to have this drop shadow appearing all over. So how do we do that in Figma? The way I do it is I just grab this and I duplicate it inside the area here that denotes all of the different variations of the search component. I can come here to the variant and you can see that we have property 1, and we're going to rename this to state. If you want to use the nomenclature, you can come in here and say, okay, this is going to be my active state, right? So this is just the default. So back here, this is how the component looks like if we're not doing any form of interaction with it or if it's not disabled. And then we're going to change this one here to hover, right? So now we have active and hover state, and you can see that for each of these, we have a different state. Let's go into our hover state component. And what we're going to do, as mentioned, is we're going to be removing the divider. So we can do that by just clicking here. So now we have a dividerless search component. And I've already created the search shadow here before because I was doing this for the end page where we can redo it. What I did is I clicked on the component and I clicked here on effects, and this will automatically add a ordinary drop shadow. And if you want to fine tune this a little bit to try and get a bit more of the look and feel, I think I did something like this. I removed the blur. Maybe let's see, actually this needs to have a little bit of blur. So let's increase the spread, which is how far the shadow is going to go beyond the background. And we can add a little bit of blur here to make it a bit more seamless. So I'm just going to go for that, maybe reduce the amount of black, and that looks pretty fine. Now, if you want to go pixel perfect, you might notice that the shadow in the bottom has a little bit more of darkness to it. So we can come here and create a second shadow that will sit on top. And I can just make this one, let's say 1Y, and then make the blur even lesser and make this very subtle, maybe with like a 6%. So now you can see you have a combination of two shadows. That looks pretty nice. Okay, so we're pretty happy with our hover state here. And now let me see if we actually created more states for this. I don't think so. No. Okay, great. So we're pretty happy with where we are here. Now, one thing you can do for extra nice documentation purposes is, well, let's keep this 2020. I'm gonna make some space here, and I'm just gonna document this on the canvas itself, and I'm gonna say home active, and you'll see why I call this home in a second. But I'm just gonna mention it, and I'm gonna drop it here. Now, this is not gonna be affected by the component layer because this is a text layer, so you can just drop this anywhere and it's not going to screw up your design. So I'm just gonna have that there and have this one sort of right there as well. So 33, there we go. And then just gonna align it with the layer, with the component itself. So, and I'm gonna change this to home hover. Now I called it home because as you'll see when I search for anything, so if I look for, let's say Figma, you can see that now we have a different kind of search component that has some icons on the right that weren't there before. And if I click on it, there is going to be a focus state where we're going to have an extension of the search box on the left, and there's going to be also a search icon on the left as well. So let's create those states in Figma. Going back to Figma. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch this down a little bit because I'm going to be adding those components right there. And I'm simply going to duplicate this again, right? So holding my Alt key. And now we have, Figma automatically adds an additional state because they want to avoid any sort of conflicts immediately. But we don't actually need this state here. What we do need is to add a new property. And this property we're going to call page. And the default is going to be home, since this is what we had already. And now we can come here and actually remove this to be just a normal active state. And Figma for a second will tell you, hey, what's going on? There's two variants that have conflicting properties. So we can resolve that immediately by just changing this to results, which is ultimately creating a new variant in our component. So if you look at the variant now, you have active and hover, and then you have home and results. And I'm just dragging that up because it's a higher order of relevance in the definition of this component, at least how I'm defining it here. Now that we've got this going on, I am simply going to come back here. I'm going to look at this and see how this is a little bit different from what we had already. So if we are comparing, we can see that in its active state, there is no search icon here, so we can get rid of that. And then there seems to be two icons here, one for clearing and then one for just triggering that search. What we will need is also going to be removing this. And now what we're going to do is we're going to be adding those two icons. So now one thing I want to show you is actually coming into the browser here, and I'm just going to inspect element. And if you're unfamiliar with inspection, each browser has its own way of going about it. I'm in Safari, so I had to go to my Safari preferences and toggle the developer mode. So I think that's like in advance. Yeah, show develop menu and menu bar. And now if I right click anywhere on the website, I can go into the inspector menu. So if I click here to highlight any piece of the interface, you can see some pretty valuable information if you're trying to mimic this on Figma. So you can see here that if I'm hovering over this button, you can see the exact proportions of width and height. Now this is not the proportions of the icon box itself. It includes also the padding. So if I click into it, you can see here in the computed values that it's actually giving me the dimensions of the inner box itself and then the padding. And this is a very nice example of why it's important to emphasize that when you're designing, you also use a sort of box model, because when you're bringing things over to code, if you are already thinking about everything as a box in your interface, it's just going to make things that much easier. So what we can take away from here is that we want to be able to provide a touch area of, let's say, just to keep it in the even pixel zone, I'm going to do 32 and 44. So I'm going to come here, and inside my component, I'm going to create a layer with a frame that's going to be 32 by 44. So I'm just going to do that right there, and I'm going to center align it. So if I'm holding my Alt key and I'm hovering over the parent container here, I can get these dimensions. And I'm just going to place it here for now because we also have to do the padding. And in this case, since it was 13, I'm just going to keep up with my 8 pixel implicit grid and stick to something like 12, which is the nearest approximate value for that. So I can come here to my constraints already and just make sure this is right center. As we will resize, we want that to be the position where the icon is kept. So I'm just going to call this search. And now we can come here, grab this icon, and place it right there. So I just literally copy pasted it. I think the dimensions are pretty much the same. We're going to keep the 16 by 16. Now I think that blue might be this Google blue that we are also using for the microphone here. So I'm just going to quickly drag that over here. That looks pretty good. And then next to it, I'm going to be creating a divider. As you saw in the design here, there's this little divider between the two icons. So I'm just going to come here, and I pressed R for rectangle, and I'm just going to make it, say, 20 pixel height. And I'm going to bring it 12 pixels to the side here. And again, I'm going to right center, and then I'm going to make sure I can use my alignment tool here to keep it centered with respect to the search component. So this sits nicely right there, and I can change this to divider, given that we have that color token already. Now the last bit is to do the clear. Actually, this is less. It's less than 12. It's more like 4, since already we have quite enough spacing inside the icon layer itself, right? So now I'm just gonna duplicate this to create the other icon area here, and we can double check what the proportions for that would be just by doing the same kind of inspection here. So you can see that there's the clear button div here that has a 49 by 44. I think more or less we can stick to similar proportions, and that's going to be just fine. The reason why these tend to be a little bit bigger, so you can see that even if I'm a little bit far away from the clear icon itself, it's still acting as if I'm part of that button. That is because desktop in itself is a very high precision environment for designs like this, right? You have the mouse as an input, and you could essentially click in every single pixel of the screen. But when it comes to controls like this, you want to give just enough area within the white space around the icon for the user to not have to click on a very particular piece of the interface in order to activate the action. And that is why for things like this, you want to typically give things a little bit more space. And the way we can highlight that in the design is just by making frames bigger. So I'm just going to remove this. And now if I want to get that icon, what I'm using for these videos is the Remix icon library, which is a free to use open source system that is great. So I can just come here and I can look for close, and somewhere down here should be what I'm looking for. Yes, right here. So I can just click here, I can copy SVG, copy it, and now I can come back to Figma, and boom, I have my icon frame. So let's just put it here for now. I have to resize it a little bit to match the dimensions of the icon here. So I'm just gonna cut that, put it in here, make sure it's centered, keep this center, and we're good to go. And the other thing I have to do is come to my selection color, hit tertiary again, and then we are good to go. And now if you see that I resize this, everything stays as expected. So now I can drag any of these, bring it down here. Oh. Sometimes it thinks that I'm dragging things inside a component. So easiest way to resolve that is just to go outside of the component layer and come back. So I'm going to change this to results, active. And now we're going to start duplicating to do the hover and the focus state. So let's come back here. I'm going to hold my Alt key and duplicate. Gonna align it just like that. And I'm gonna change the state here to hover. Now this is the same kind of styling that we applied to the previous one, so you should be already familiar with this. And that is why I came here and I made a reusable style out of the shadows, because we were reusing it for the other components. So I can just come here and I would create a style, but since I already have a style called search shadow, I'm just gonna actually change it with this one. And now I can come here, go to effects and apply that same search shadow, and there we go. The last thing we have to do here is remove the divider, and there we go. Now we have our hover search in the results page. So one thing to do here I forgot is to change the layer name here to divider, just to keep things clean, and this we can call clear. Having a clean layer structure can go a very long way. Okay, so last thing we want to do here, now that we have our active state and our hover state, the last one that we're missing is our focus state. So for that, I'm just going to make sure that these, before I resize the window, I'm going to keep them to left and top, so now I can do something like this, and we won't have any distortions that we do not want. And I'm just going to copy paste this explainer here and drag it all the way to my search. There we go. And I'm going to change this to results hover, and I'm going to duplicate this one, and I'm just going to drop it right here. And we can also do this and make sure that it is nicely centered, nicely aligned with our layer, and we can call this results focus. And in here we gotta do the same thing, come to our state here, change this to focus, no more conflicts. So this one's actually quite tricky, and I'm not gonna actually need a little bit more distancing here from the left, because if you go back to that google.com page and you were to click on it, you can see that everything expands a little bit to the left to include that search icon here. So that's what we're gonna do in this video. And one additional thing is that you can see that the corner radius on the bottom left and bottom right is going to be going down all the way to 0 because afterwards we'll be adding, in the prototyping, we'll be adding that section that you can see for the search results. And this is where the corner radius will come back into place. Okay, so the first thing we can do here is come to our component, come over to the corner radius, and what we're going to do is we're going to define the bottom left and bottom right. Instead of to this crazy 400, we're going to put it at 0. So now we've achieved that bit. And actually these don't have to be so large. We're going to actually bring them to 24 pixels. And if you're wondering how I got those values, is through that same method of inspecting and having a look at the computed values. So if I were to just look at that right now, I could click on inspect while this is selected, and I could come here to the layer and just click right here. And you can see that even in the box model, in the computed values, it gives you a little bit of that corner radius in this graph itself, so that's pretty nice. And I can just come down here to the properties and search for something like this, like border, bottom left radius, border, bottom right radius. So these are the same kind of properties that we are then adjusting in Figma. And you can see that this is set right now to 0, 0. And if I'm looking for border top, you can see I have border top left radius 24 and 24. So that is how I got those values. So that looks pretty good. And now the last piece we have to figure out is see how much we want to stretch this. And we can come back here and sort of get an idea of that by looking more or less at this icon right here of the search. So we could just say, okay, this is a 20 pixel box, right? So, and the height is what we are used to. So I can just grab this since it's the same icon, and I could bring it over here. And then let's see, there is about 14 on the side. So we're going to keep this at 12 right there. And I'm just going to change the constraints to left and center. And I'm going to change the color. Since this is not blue, we're going to change it to icon. And actually, we should be using that icon color here as well, now that I'm thinking about it, and that looks more appropriate. And now we can come back here, just leave it at 12. And if we want to keep a measurement of the text here, we have our text layer here hidden. I'm going to unhide it by just clicking on the eye icon here. And I'm just going to change this, instead of to 4, I'm going to have 12 pixel padding here from the text, and then make sure that that padding is respected from the right. So let's do it with respect to the button, and that should be pretty good. I did not design this with the appropriate dimensions that you might see on the search page. This might be a little bit larger in that page, but that's fine because we already have the constraints. So if we want to get to the real world pixel perfect value, we can do that easily. So just for now, I'm going to make this just a tiny bit bigger, maybe increase by 20 just to show that off. So now it's 604, and you could come here and change that and align it, and this is looking pretty good. So now, and we can select all of it and bring it down a little bit and align it, and I can grab one of these titles and I can align it on the left as well, and I can call this search. And now we have our search component. So now how you would go about applying this, and just to show you how it all comes together, I'm going to come here to one of these, and I'm going to grab this page right here. We're going to bring it down to our start page here. Let's just keep sort of proportional spacing in between. So if this is 240, let's say, then let's respect that between the different segments of our design. So now I have the pages here, and you see this one does not have a component. So what we can do is we can come here, we can copy, and we can paste it right in place and remove the existing layer. Or something else you can do is, with this selected here, you can come to your assets panel on the left. So switch from layers to assets, and you will see that you will have your local components defined here. Now I have both end and start because I have the components already defined at the end stage, but you should be able to find yours here in the page that you created the component in. So for example, just so you see, if I were to change this page to components, it would change this as well. So just so you get an idea of how that works. So I can come to the assets, select this, bring it over. So now I have the component here, and I can just copy paste it in place. I can remove the existing one, and then I can make sure that these constraints are the same as the layer that preceded. And if you see the symbol here, you can tell based on what we said earlier, this is a instance of your main search component that we just defined. And you can play around with it with the variants. You can see that you could change this, for example, to state hover, right? So that would give you a hover state for that component. And you could change it to focus because there is theoretically a focus state, but it's not for this component in particular. The thing is that Figma is showing you this focus because there's a focus state for one other variant. So you don't actually want to do that. You want to just keep it at hover, and if something else shows up here, just ignore it. And we're just going to leave it in our active state. We could do a duplicate here just for the sake of documenting things. And you could show here how the search would act in hover. And there we have it. Now that is it for today. In the next video, we're going to look at the search result and the video result component. And then we will be in a pretty good shape to prototype and animate our design and talk about a couple ways that we could expand it even further outside the scope of this series. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you're new to my channel. If you have any questions or comments, make sure to drop them in the comment section down below. I will see you in the next one.